Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. You know, the Pet Sounds app was a nice way to learn about XAML and Windows Phone development and layout and media, the media element and playing sounds and things of that nature. But now we have commercial aspirations with our app. So in this lesson, what we want to do is sit down and think about designing and developing a more robust version of our Pet Sounds app. A soundboard app with many different types of categories of sounds and perhaps even the ability to record our own sounds so that we can annoy our friends and loved ones. Okay, so in our game plan for this lesson is that we're going to start by sketching out some ideas on paper, what I call a low-tech mock-up. We'll sketch some ideas about the user interface of our app, about the interaction between the user and our app, and think through how we want the user to be able to navigate between things and click on things and things of that nature, all right? And then we'll begin the process of setting up the new app. So we're going to create a new project. We'll copy assets into the project. We'll set up the app resources.rsx file. All the things that we learned about before, but these are tasks that we now need to perform for our brand new project. So there's not a lot to learn here necessarily. These are just steps that we're going to have to go through to create a new project. All right. So as we set out to think about designing our first commercial app, I'd recommend that you take some time and you read through this article. It's awesome. Windows Phone 8 design process. If you've never been part of a creative process of designing apps or websites before, this is invaluable information, so don't skip over it. And then also there is this template for sketching up what I call a low-tech mock-up. And you can find it at the URL on screen right now. You can see this is a blank version of it. And these templates are not only useful for getting your ideas down on paper, but also for thinking through the user's interaction with the app and what feedback we can show the user about the functionality of the app. And so then I can also use this low-tech mock-up that I draw on with a pen or pencil in order to communicate my design and my interaction ideas to other people, to gather feedback before I waste time developing the app, just to realize that I made a major flaw in the way I'm thinking about designing the app from a user interface perspective or an interaction perspective because I assumed too much. Sometimes as developers we have the curse of knowledge. We know what we're trying to do, but it's not always obvious to somebody else. So getting feedback early in the design process is crucial, and a low-tech mock-up on a template like this one, like you see on the screen, the location for that file is invaluable. All right? So, practicing what I preached, I use that template to sketch my ideas for the soundboard app, and you see a larger version on screen here. But the design was largely inspired by the pivot app project template that we learned about in the previous lesson. So there's going to be several pivot items, or categories of sounds, views, types. I might use all these different, these terms to indicate these categories, these pivot items that will each contain a number of sound tiles. And so then when you tap on one of the sound tiles, I want to actually then play that sound. And I also want to be able to record a sound. So I have some other screens that I mocked up for that purpose as well. I'll have an app bar at the very bottom of the main page, and tapping on the little record button will allow you to record a sound. Now, my original design was that I would have 3 buttons on the page, one to record, one to play back, and then one to save the sound that you're working on. But then we had the idea that we could provide some visual feedback to the user. And to do that, we could easily create sort of a reel-to-reel player, from way back in the 1960s, and we can animate that while recording. You can see I drew little arrows to indicate that it would rotate while you're recording, and that would offer some great visual feedback to the user that recording is now in progress. And then finally, clicking the save button in another app bar would then allow you to provide a name for the sound, and it would be displayed in a pivot item tile, a pivot item named mine or custom or something like that. That you would see here then at the very top. Now, besides the design process, there's always some effort in getting the assets that you need for a project like this. Now, in this case, we're providing you with the sounds and the images to follow along with our example here. But truth be told, Clint Rutkiss spent a few hours working with a sound guy and a graphic artist. And in my experience, the effort required to bring in creative types, people that are creatively minded, not programmers necessarily, or to actually build the creative assets yourself should not be underestimated. It can be challenging even in a simple app. If you have serious commercial aspirations, I would find somebody well-versed in the area of creativity that you need, whether it be sound or a visual designer or whatever the case might be, especially if you're not an expert in that area already. You can waste a lot of time trying to make your images and your sounds just right and still fall far short of something that can pass as professional quality. So whether it be for a website or for an app that I've worked on, I have never regretted paying a professional, whether it be a sound guy or more likely a visual designer, for their help to make my apps or my websites look spectacular. It's made me look more professional than I really am, honestly. But at any rate, just a little bit of planning up front and some time spent acquiring the assets that I'll need, I have a good direction for my app. So let's go ahead and get started developing the app itself. And to do that, what I'm going to do is going to go File, New Project, and we're going to make sure to create a new Windows Phone Pivot app, right? And we're going to call this Soundboard. Soundboard, and click OK. And we're going to target the 8.0 version of the operating system. And the first thing I want to do is include those assets that Clint Rutkiss acquired into our app. And I'm going to do that by going, first of all, to our existing assets folder that was set up by the project template. And I want to delete everything inside of here first. So I'm going to select it all, right-click, and select Delete. It asks, do you want to delete it permanently? Yes, I do. Next, I want to open up the folder where we have the assets for these projects. Now, I happen to unzip that file to my Documents directory. Wherever you unzipped it, you'll recall we used this already for the Pet Sounds assets. This time we're going to use it for the Soundboard assets. So I'm going to drill into that subfolder. And here what I want to do is just select everything in here. I click on the first item, hold down the Shift button, click on the last item. And now what I want to do is drag and drop to the Assets folder in the Solution Explorer, and it will copy a bunch of files into my Assets folder. Okay, very good. And we can kind of look through here. We've got some tiles, we've got some audio, animals, cartoons, taunts, warnings, very good. And that should pretty much do it. We also have an application icon. If I hover over it, well, let's double click it. See it in the main area here, or actually in Paint. Can't see it because it has a translucent background. You'll see it soon enough. All right, so now in the Properties folder, the next thing I want to do is open up my WM app manifest.xml file into the main area. And what I want to do here is ensure that the app icon as well as the small and medium icons are set properly, and it looks like they are. We have just a little microphone icon, so that's good. We haven't talked about this yet, but Windows Phone 8 projects support 3 different tile templates. There is a flip template, a cycle template, and an iconic template. And the link that you see on screen right now does a really nice job of explaining the different types of templates for the tiles. In this app, our needs are simple, but later on in this series, we're going to be able to use a cycle template to see how to programmatically give it a list of images to cycle through. Now, personally, I love any type of data visualization, so I love those apps that use the iconic template for anything that has a lot of updatable information that can be displayed in a tile. For example, on my own phone, I have this weather app that updates the tile with the temperature, the humidity, the wind, the visibility, and so on. And I have another app that displays the amount of battery remaining in an iconic tile rather. And also I have a countdown app that shows me the number of days until I'm able to take my Colorado vacation, okay? So I have actively sought out apps like these in the store because I think they make my start page look cool, again, as an end user of the phone. And so think seriously. If you have information that can be displayed iconically, then you might want to choose to go the route of using the template iconic and then approach development from that perspective. All right, so let's go ahead. I don't think we had any changes to this page. What I want to do next, though, is I want to think about configuring the title of the main page to pull from the app resources.resx file. I don't plan on localizing our application completely, but I'm going to go ahead and set up the app so that we could easily add it in the future and expand the number of markets that we can sell our app to. So to begin that process, what I want to do is open up the main page.xaml, and I want to locate the phone.pivot element. I'm going to look at the title attribute, and what I want to do is change this from just a hard-coded string to a binding syntax. We're going to change this to binding path equals localized resources dot application title, and then we want to set the source equal to a static resource localized strings. And we've already talked about this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it right now, but I will move it onto a different line like so. Okay. And now in the app resources directory, I'm going to come in here and I want to change the application title from my application to soundboard. All right, and we'll save all that. And let's go ahead and just look at it here, and let's even just run the app just to make sure that that change took. Okay, and it did. You can see the name of our app, Soundboard, shows up, and we're using a pivot app template. We're good to go so far. So to recap, not a whole lot of new in this lesson per se, but these are the type of tasks that we need to perform each time we undertake a new project. We did talk about a few new topics, like focusing on the design and the interaction of the app and choosing from the different types of tile templates that are available. So we'll pick this back up in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. Now that we've completed some of the basic setup chores, we want to focus on the heart of the application. No, it's not the media, it's actually the data model. This requires that we translate our low-tech mockup that we talked about in the previous lesson into a viable data model that best represents the data and the hierarchical relationships between the data. So our game plan in this lesson is to first of all briefly analyze our requirements. Really the mock-up is all that we have, plus whatever we talked about in the last lesson or two. And we're going to quickly diagram a data model that we're going to implement in our app using C#. Then we're going to implement the data model in code, and we'll create some data in an XML file that will be used as design time data for the purpose of displaying something in our apps, in our main page's XAML designer. And then we're going to modify the main page.xaml's binding expressions to point to instances of classes and properties in our new data model that we're going to design right now. Okay? So after looking over the mock-ups and thinking about how best to delegate responsibilities to the various classes, I came up with a very basic model that's my first best guess at how to structure the data that I'm going to need for the app. And so you can see it here on screen as a UML or a class diagram. Essentially, there are three classes: a sound model class, a sound group class, and a sound data class. And notice that each of the properties in sound model are of type sound group. All right, so in other words, animals, cartoons, taunts, warnings, these are what I've been calling categories, which will eventually become pivot items that we can kind of browse through. So each of those items will have a title, which will be of type string, and then they'll also have a collection of items. And notice that collection is a list of type, or a list of T, and the T is sound data. So each sound data object will represent a tile that we'll be able to push on, and when the user pushes on it, and they'll be able to see what it is. It'll be a meow or a quack or a bark or something like that. And then when they click on it, we'll use the file path property then to actually retrieve the file from one of our the audio folders, right, and to play the given wave file that's associated with that object that we're clicking on. Okay. So again, the sound group represents what I've been calling a view or a type. I've struggled for the correct terminology here, but in essence, it's a grouping. It's not a view, which only connotes the visual aspect of the sound tiles. And it's not really a type, which has special connotations in the .NET world. A sound group has a title that'll be used to display the title of the pivot item in the pivot control on the main page.xaml. And it also has that generic collection of sound data. The sound data class represents the sounds themselves. Each instance of sound data will be displayed in a tile, and by tapping the tile, we're going to play the sound that's associated with the sound data as it's stored in the file path property, right? So given this clarity, it's time to implement the diagram we see here in C# code. I'm sure that there's going to be a few additions as we go along, but this is a good start in the right direction, I think. So let's go ahead and we're going to create the new data model classes for our app. We have a plan and we have our data model diagram in tow. So we're going to begin implementing that new data model. So to do that, what I want to do is go to the View Models folder, and I'm going to use that folder, repurpose it for our new view model. And I'm going to select, right-click it and select Add New Item. And I want to make sure that I'm in the C# templates, and I want to choose the class, and we're going to call this class Sound Data. Click OK or Add. And it's loaded in the main area, and what I want to do is add two public properties per our diagram. So I'm going to go prop tab tab, in this case, string title, enter, enter, and then prop tab tab, string tab tab, file path, enter, enter. All right, so there are my two public properties. And now I want to add another item, another add new item, and this time I want to call this class, I'm going to call it sound group, and click add. And the very first thing we want to do in the sound group, I'm going to actually make it a public class, and I probably should do that for sound data as well before I forget. There we go. All right, and what I want to do here is I'm going to create a constructor called public sound group, and we'll also create prop tab tab. We're going to do a list of sound data called items, and then another string called title, right? And then here what I want to do in the constructor is create a new instance of the list of sound data. So I'm going to set items equal new list of sound data, like so. Great. Whoops. And I can see I named things differently. Just make sure that they all match up there. Items, items. Okay, we're good to go. Nice. Okay, and then we're going to add one more class to the View Models folder. Right-click, select Add New Item, and this class will be called the Sound Model. It'll be the topmost class in our hierarchy. It'll contain a sound group for each of the view or the categories of sounds that we're going to display in our app, the groupings, all right? It'll also implement the logic to determine whether data has already been loaded into the new data model, and it's going to have the vast majority of code to create instances of the sound data classes for each sound that we want to use in our app, just like we saw in the main view model with its isDataLoaded property and the load data that we talked about 2 lessons ago, right? So we're going to kind of duplicate that here, but with our own data. Okay, so we're going to start simple, and then we're going to grow this important class out throughout the rest of this lesson, the next couple of lessons. All right, so to begin, let's just get going here with, we'll make this public. Very good. And then we're going to go prop tab tab. I'm going to make a sound group called custom sounds. Prop tab tab sound group animals. Prop tab tab sound group tab tab cartoons. Enter enter. Prop tab tab sound group, and we're just going to keep following that. Taunts. So, sound group. Warnings. I think that's the last one. Okay, then we're going to need that is data loaded. So prop bool is data loaded. And then finally what I want to do is create a method, public void load data. And this is where we're going to do where all the magic happens. And so let me just for now put a little placeholder here, load data into the model, because we're going to have to come back to that and do a lot of work there later in another lesson. But when it is called, we'll say the data is loaded equal true. Okay, great. So before we perform the bulk of the work in the load data method, and what we'll do is probably create some helper methods to help with the heavy lifting so that we don't have like a method that's just a bajillion lines long, right? We want it to keep things a little bit smaller. What I want to do is replace the old data model that's being used by the project template. I want to replace it in the app with the new one that we just created by changing the class that the app.xaml.cs uses to back its view model property. So first I'm going to comment out the references to the old model in the app.xaml.cs. And I typically comment things out that I no longer think I need before I actually delete them from the project. This is a habit that I've acquired through the years. I've hastily deleted code thinking, I don't need it, I'll replace it later, only to realize that there was some small detail that I was missing. However, since I deleted the old working version and I can no longer reference it, it becomes more time consuming and painful to determine where I made the mistake. So here I'm going to comment out the implementation of the main view model property. So here, and both the private backing field as well as the public getter and setter. So what I'll do is I'm going to start here with a multi-line comment and close the multi-line comment. So now that's gone. Great. And next I'm going to implement the new version of the view model using our new data model type sound model. So here we go. Make some room for ourselves. Private, and we'll make this static. So we only need one instance, or we don't even need an instance of this, right? It's just, it'll be created without instance. And then we'll go public static sound model, view model. Whoops, we gotta name it with a capital V for view model because it's gonna be public. And then we'll create our getter. And I don't think we need a setter, right? So if view model equals null, then view model equals new sound model, sound model, and return the view model. Great. All right, it's not happy about something here. Because I didn't comment out this line of code there. So we need to comment out the old private version as well as the public property so that when we create the new one, this will work correctly. All right, got that? Very good. So that's all that should be required. References to the sound models is data loaded and load data method now should work fine. They're now pointing here instead of the old place where they were pointing in our main view model. Great. Now that I've removed the old data model from the app, I'm sure that I've broken several other things. But at this moment, I'm most concerned about the the Sampl view here in the designer, the binding expressions are pointing at properties that no longer exist. So you might say, well, okay, we've eliminated it, any references to the old main view model here in the app.sampl.cs. Why does this still display correctly in the Sampl editor? Well, that's because at design time, this data context is pulling only from this main view model sample data. All right, so once we remove this reference, it's all going to collapse on us. So that's our next order of business, is to take some time to kind of massage all this back into working form, and to replace this design time data file with our own version. And so I'm going to have to do this in small chunks. My first priority is to make some design time data available so that I can then edit the Sampl views here by using the Sampl editor and the designer, and visually see feedback about the changes that I'm making. All right. So what I want to do is right-click in the sample data folder and select Add New Item, and I want to add a Windows Phone portrait page. Now we're only just using this because it's a Sampl page, and we'll add data to it. We're not worried about the visual designer of it, as you'll see here in a minute. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to remove everything about this file that makes it a Sampl page. So I'm just going to select it all, including phone application page, and just delete it all. And when I do that, and if I were to save, you'll see that the editor will get confused here in a minute. Yeah, and it says invalid markup, right? So that's fine. And what I want to do now is I want to add my own Sampl that will comprise sample data for the app. Before I do that, however, let me go, and I want to drill down, because by default you get this sample data.sampl.cs file, and I just want to delete that as well. We don't need a code behind for this. Again, the only reason we're using a Sampl file is so that we can bind to it at design time. All right, so back here in the sample data.sampl file, I'm going to hide the visual designer completely, just move it off the screen like that. And I need to add quite a bit of code in this file, in the sample data.sampl file. Now, there's a couple of things that we could do here, but I don't want to take the time to type all this out, and it's just going to be a typing exercise. So I've made available this file, and I've happened to add it, unzip it here to my desktop. Just make sure that you find this file wherever you currently are viewing this video or downloaded these videos from originally. I may even put them here in the download for the entire project with all the assets and everything. There also will be a code listing, and you can just below this video where you're currently viewing the embedded version, you can just select it all, copy and paste it in your project. For my purposes, I'm going to right click this and select Open With, and in Windows 8 it'll give me just a couple of options, but I'm going to click More Options in order to select Notepad. And so I can see this whole thing, this whole file in Notepad. You can see that we get a sound model, and we're calling its animals, its cartoons property, its taunts property, which is essentially just containing a sound group item. And each sound group will then have a collection called items with individual sound data instances. So I want to copy this whole thing. I hit Control-A on my keyboard, Control-C, go back into Visual Studio, and then I'm just going to paste this whole thing in here, and you can see it show up correct. And you might get this blue squiggly, but I suspect that's because we haven't compiled our app just yet, and once we compile it, it'll find the proper namespace for the new classes that we've created. Let me just make sure that they are indeed in the correct namespace. That one's correct, and that one's correct. So I suspect that this will resolve itself after we, build the solution. We might find other errors in the build. Now it looks like it succeeded. So now when we go back to sample data.sampl, it clears up all the blue squigglies. All right, very good. And so I think it's important here to see, well, why are we prefixing, the word sound model with the letter VM? Again, because we declare that namespace reference of VM to the CLR namespace of soundboard.viewModels, which is where sound model, sound group, and sound data, the namespace that they belong to. Okay, that's the only reason that exists. The rest are just for so that this XAML can be represented correctly, like we talked about very early on in the series of videos with the namespaces. Okay, so moving on here, what I want to do is now use this new sample data in my main page.xaml. And to do that, I'm going to go to my main page.xaml file, and I want to look for this design time data context. So the D, again, indicates that namespace that would allow us to use the XAML at design time. And remember, the next line, this OpenXML formats, it makes that XAML prefixed with the letter D ignorable at runtime, but at design time, we're able to use it to set the data context to this sample data / main view model sample data.xaml. So all we need to do here is just remove this like so, and now we have reset the data context for our pivots to the sample data.xaml that we just created. Now everything disappears, you can see, in our XAML designer, but that's okay. The reason why everything is gone is because we no longer have items, and no longer do they bind to line 1 and line 2 attributes of the items that they're binding to. Okay, so we're going to need to change some things about this. So the first thing we're going to want to do in our first pivot is I'm going to change this binding expression from items to animals.items. And then I'm going to change the binding here for the text block 1 to title and file path, which I know to be properties on our sound data class. And when I do that, notice that now we can now see animals1 and animals.wave. These are both from our sample data for the animals sound group. Okay? Let me also change this header. Currently it says the word first, but I can change that to a binding expression. Binding to animals.title. Awesome. And you can see it changed from the word first to the word animals. So how do we get to animals here? Well, just to be clear, animals is a public property of sound model, which is the parent class that's defined here in our sample data.xaml file, which we set as the data context for the entire main page.xaml. Therefore, every child property of the sound model in that file are accessible. So animals and cartoons and taunts and the other ones that we created as well. All right, since the long list selectors item source attribute is set to animals.items, and items is a list of sound data, we can therefore reference any property in the sound data class inside of the data template. So I set the text attribute to the title property of the sound data class and the file path property of the sound data class. And then I set the header in the binding of the pivot item to animals.title. Again, I can reference animals because its parent, the sound model, is set as the data context for the entire main page.xaml. All right. In the XAML designer, we now see what it will look like, at least for this first pivot item. Very cool. And so hopefully you can see the correlation between the main page.xaml's controls and the sample data for animals, like you see, here, like we talked about a moment ago. We made a change to the first pivot item, and now what we want to do is change the second pivot item to display the sound group cartoons. And so what we're going to do, you'll see that it's practically identical to what we wrote for animals. So I'm simply going to go here to the pivot item. I'm going to copy everything about that pivot item. Control C on my keyboard once I have the entire open and close pivot item selected. And I'm going to go and replace this pivot item. And then all I'm going to do is change from animals, everywhere it says animals in pivot item 2, to cartoon. Cartoons, I think, right? And here again, cartoons.items. And the title and the file path should be the same. And now we see cartoons 1 and cartoons 2. And if we compare that to what we see in the sample data.xaml, that's exactly what we see as the two items there. And the title is Cartoon Sample. Let's see if that shows up. Yep, Cartoon Sample here at the very top in the pivot items title. Okay. And so now when I put my mouse cursor either in the pivot item 2 or pivot item 1, notice that it changes which pivot is currently being displayed here in the main area. Very cool. Okay, so I think that's enough for this lesson. To recap, the big takeaway in this lesson is how we replace the default data model and the sample data in the pivot project template with our own new data model for working with groups of sounds, and I'm bound to the new sample data by modifying the main page.xaml's page and control declarations. We learned about data contexts and how they're set and accessed from within the page, like we did when we changed it right here. Okay, so hopefully that all made sense. At least you can see the correlations of how everything is related. And so we're just going to continue on with these sorts of modifications for the next couple of lessons. We'll see you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In the previous lesson, we made a lot of progress in wiring up a new data model to the main page.xaml. And now we need to focus on the layout of the data template themselves in our long list selectors. We're going to want to tweak each instance of sound data so that they resemble tiles instead of rows the way that they are right now. So if we compare our original drawings in our low-tech mock-up with the current state of the app's UI, the layout isn't quite right, and that's what we're going to remedy in this lesson. Okay, so what we're going to do is modify, our game plan is to modify the long list selector to utilize grid layout mode instead of what we're using now, which is the default. I think it's just called row layout. Okay, and then we're going to completely rework the layout of each data template so that it more closely resembles a tile instead of a row. All right, and since we need 5 or 6 of these pivot items, each with their own long list selector, it doesn't make sense to keep defining them like we've done here with just big sections of XAML code. Instead, we're going to abstract them out into a centralized template that can be reused by all of the long list selectors in our main page.xaml. It'll save a lot of space as we visually peruse, and we can make change to one of the templates, and it'll modify all of them that use that template. I'll show you what that means here in just a minute. Okay, so basically the long list selector supports a layout mode property that we're currently not setting because we're just using the default. It accepts an enumeration of either list, which is the default, or grid. By setting the layout mode to grid and then setting a cell size in terms of width and height and pixels, we can quickly change the appearance of the long list selector, and it'll look a lot like what we're trying to get at here in our low-tech mockup. So let's go here to our animals pivot item, and what we want to do is below where we've defined our item source, we're going to set the layout mode equal to grid, and then we're going to set the grid cell size equal to 150 by 150. All right, and so now you can see that here our long list selector data template has changed significantly. All we really did though was change the layout mode from list to grid. All right, so next we want to modify what's inside of this data template to match our desired layout. So what I want to do here is I'm going to highlight everything inside that has to go. We're going to basically remove everything inside of the data template. The stack panel with the 2 text blocks got to go. And then I'm going to start over with a grid control inside of each cell. So here we go with the grid, and inside of the grid we're going to create a stack panel. And the stack panel will have inside of it a text block. And tell you what we're going to do here. We're going to do a self-enclosing tag, and we're going to set the text equal to, and we'll set the binding up so we can see the title attribute. All right, very good. So far, so good. Hey, let's go ahead and change the background of this grid to use whatever the user has selected as their accent color for the phone. Like in my case, it's the yellow because I got the yellow phone. But if somebody had the red phone version of this, or just set it up in their on their phone's properties, we want to use what they've used. So what do? We use a static resource, one of the built-in templates, themes that are available. So static resource, and we want the phone accent brush here. And so in this case, since it's set up in our device settings to be red, we see a big red grid. Awesome. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to move this this text block to the bottom, and also let's see if I can get out of this view. It's butted up against the left-hand side, and I suspect it'll be butted up against the bottom too when we move it down. And so I'm going to want to add some margin space around there. So let's start by moving it to the bottom, and I'm going to go to the stack panel, and I'm going to set its vertical alignment to the bottom. Okay, so that's a good first step. And now I want to add to the text block itself, we're going to add some margin, and I'm going to add it to, starting on the left-hand side, working my way around, 6 pixels, and then 0 top, 0 right, and then 6 pixels to the bottom. And so now it has moved that, as you can see nicely, just a few pixels to give it a little bit of breathing room. Great. Okay, and so the next thing I want to do is I want to that if you look on the original drawing that I had, we had a little play button in the upper right-hand corner to indicate that it's clickable. So it gives the user some visual idea that you should be able to click on this and it will play a sound. And so what we want to do is use this little icon here. Let's find it in our assets, app bar, play, and as I hover over it, you can see it's translucent, meaning that there will be no background color to it, which is good because we want the red to shine through, or the yellow, or whatever the accent brush is, but it'll have a little triangle on the top. So and I'm going to add an inner grid and then set its vertical alignment to the top and its horizontal alignment to the right, so that I get it up here in this upper right hand corner. And the play.png is just an arrow, but I want there to be a circle around it as well. So I guess what I could do is go back to the drawing board and rework that image and add a circle around it, but you know, that's going to take me some time to relaunch. I think it'd be a simple solution just to add that ellipse, that circle in Sampl around that image. And so that's what we'll set out to do now. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with this. Let's move this over a little bit. And inside of this grid, I want to create another grid. And I'm going to set its vertical alignment to the top, and I'm going to set its horizontal alignment equal to the right. And it's going to be pretty small, so I want the width and height to be pretty tiny. 40 pixels should do it. So the width and the height of the grid will be 40 by 40. And I'm going to come back. I know I'm going to add a margin to it in a little bit. What I want to do first is to add the image. And so I'm going to create an image element and set its source equal to assets/appbar/play.png. And then we'll go ahead and close that out. And so now you can see the little arrow in the upper right hand corner. Great. And then the next thing I want to do is put an ellipse around it. So let's start with an ellipse element. And I'm going to set the stroke equal to static resource phone foreground brush. Great. And then I'm also here, let's just close it off and we can see it's, so we see a white line around it, or maybe a gray line, I'm not sure which, but the if we were to kind of, let's get into this a little closer here, you can see that that line is, that stroke around it's not so pronounced. So what we'll want to do is increase the thickness of that stroke. So we'll set the stroke thickness attribute equal to 3, and now it's much thicker. And that looks pretty nice. Great. But it's also butted up against the top and right-hand side. So what I want to do is add a margin for this little grid that contains my ellipse and my image. So underneath the height attribute, I'm going to add a margin of 0 to the left, 6 to the top, 6 to the right, and then 0 to the bottom. And that should push it out away just enough. Great. Looks awesome. Okay, so these changes make each tile look close to what I had originally envisioned in my low-tech mock-up. And now we need to apply this to the other pivot items data template as well, for example, cartoons and the other ones we'll create. So, you know, in the previous lesson, we saw the behavior of the Sampl designer. If we put our mouse cursor in this, let's move this down a little bit, 30%, there we go. If we put our mouse cursor in a different pivot item, it will display it in the visual editor as opposed to the other item, so we can select back and forth and see the different ways that these appear, the different pivot items. So instead of copying and pasting this entire data template from here into here, what I would prefer to do is define the data template that I'm going to use as a page level resource. And so, you know, you should recall this from what we did earlier. What I'm going to do is go to the phone application page dot resources and create a resources section for this page. And next what I want to do is I'm going to cut and paste this template here, this data template, out of here, and I'm going to paste it into this resources section. Okay, and let's clean some of these lines up. Now we're getting all these blue squigglies, and we'll fix that here in just a second. The reason why we're getting these blue squigglies, I think, is that we're going to need to add a key attribute. And so this key attribute is like a name. It'll allow me to reference this data template from the rest of the page when I need it. In fact, I think what I did wrong is I need the entire data template. So let's go ahead and copy this out. Put this here. There we go. And then we're going to need to close that up too. So let's go /data template, like so. And then just for safekeeping, I'm going to need to move some things in a little bit. Yeah. All right, that looks good. And we're going to want to move this all in as well, like so. Okay, indentation looks good now. I'm happy with that. And we're going to need to give this data template a key. So x key equals sound tile data template. Great. Okay, now I just need to reference that key that we just created, the sound tile data template, in my long list selectors item template property, like so. In fact, I don't need this property element syntax anymore. We're just going to get rid of all that. And instead, we're going to go item template, and then static resource sound tile data template, like that. Great. And now you can see that when I made that change and I set that resource back as, set it to the item template attribute, we got our sample data to show up again in the Visual Designer. So we're on the right track here. And so what I want to do is repeat this process for the second item, the second pivot item. I'm going to delete this whole item template like so. And what I'm going to do instead is, actually I'm just going to go ahead and copy this whole long list data selector since we changed the layout mode and some other things. Let's go ahead and blow it all away and start over. And this time we're going to change it from animals to cartoons, like so. Okay, very cool. And now you can see the impact that it's had. Let's go Control A, let's go like 66% there. You can see that we have successfully used this sound tile data template in both pivot items. But now that we're looking at an item that has more than one tile, we can see that we have a new issue that pops up. The two tiles are butted up right next to each other. So why didn't I notice this before? Simply because we just had one item. All right. Clearly we're going to need to remedy this because it just doesn't look right, and as a result it might confuse the user. They might not see two distinct tiles there, but just one bar of red or whatever the phone accent brush color that they chose. So to remedy this, what I want to do is add a margin to the bottom right of each grid that defines the boundaries for each data item. So let's go back up to our resources here. And what I want to do is add a margin to this topmost grid. So here we go, margin equals, and we'll say 0 to the left, 0 to the top, but 12 to the right and 12 to the bottom. And now when I go to the second item, you can see we get that nice separation. There's some black color between the reds. Awesome. Okay, so the last task is now to create pivot items for each of the other data groups that I'm going to support in my app, including taunts, warnings, and then custom sounds. So what I'm going to do is merely just take these pivot items, this pivot item here, and I'm going to Control C to copy it. I'm going to paste it 3 times. And then what I want to do is change each of these. So like, for example, taunts and taunts. And the next one we'll do warnings and warnings. And then finally we'll do, whoops, this should be warnings here. And then we'll do custom sounds here. And custom sounds. Like so. Okay, so I've warned you before about the dangers of copying and pasting code. There's a chance you'll forget to modify one little bit of data that makes each pasted item a little bit different. So pay attention to the details. Make sure that you're modifying each pasted item in 2 spots. You can see what happened to me when I forgot that. Change it here for the header and for the item source bindings. All right. Okay, so to recap, the big takeaway from this lesson was how to style the long list selector by changing the layout mode from list to grid, and then setting the various tile sizes using the grid cell size attribute as well. We also learned how we can take things like data templates and define them at a higher level here as page resources, and then be able to use them throughout the rest of the page. We also learned how to use an image control, like we used here, and then how to add simple shapes like ellipses to enhance the visual design. When you build apps, you need to spend a lot of time tweaking the visual appearance and have an eye for detail. And so hopefully that came through as we were looking at margins and how close things are to their boundaries and how things butt up against each other. Hopefully you got a sense of that. Pay attention to those little details. All right, so we'll pick it back up in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. So how far along are we in the soundboard app so far? Well, first of all, we have a new data model in place. And in the previous lesson, we added sample data that we used at design time to help us properly lay out the app's user interface, particularly the data template that's bound to instances of the sound data class. Now in this lesson, we want to turn our attention to binding to real data at runtime. Now, up to this point, we've only been binding to this XAML file with sample data, and we could use this same XAML file for live data at runtime in our app. If you wanted to implement it that way, you certainly could, and you've already got a head start to taking that approach. All you got to do is just build out this XAML file with more instances of sound group and sound data, and then load that file at runtime using the sound model class's load data method. And then create instances of the given classes based on the serialized XML data here in sampledata.xaml file. All right. In fact, this might be a really good way to challenge yourself. After you finish this series of lessons, you could go back, you could recreate this app, but stop at this point and then take a different data access approach. You only learn when you struggle, and an exercise like this would force you to figure out how to load the XAML data into our data model at runtime. All right, but I digress. Our game plan for this lesson is, first of all, in the soundmodel.cs file, we're going to create a series of helper methods, and each helper method is designed to create instances of the sound data and sound group classes. So we're going to create helper methods called create animals group and create cartoons group and so on. Each one of these helper methods will create instances of the sound data class and then add them to the proper sound group's items collection, like we have defined right here. Okay? And then after we have all of our helper methods complete, then we're going to modify this load data method right here, and we're going to call each of those helper methods so that when we call load data, real data will be available at runtime. It'll set the is data loaded to true, and then we can bind at runtime and all will be good. Okay? So you can see what happens if we were to run the app right now. We get no data inside of our app. It's because we aren't currently loading anything in our load data method. So let's go ahead and fix that right now. What we want to accomplish is to set each of the public properties of our sound model class, like the animals property, for example, and the cartoons property, to an instance of the sound group object that's already loaded with data. So let's do this. What I'm going to do is show you an example of what I'm trying to achieve here. I'm going to set the animals property equal to, and here's where I'm going to call a helper method that I'll create in just a moment. Animals group. So we'll call it like that, and let's go ahead and just generate the method stub for this. Inside of here, we'll do something like this. We're going to create a new sound group object called data equals new sound group. And then we're going to return that at the very end. In between, what we're going to do is something like this, data.items.add, and then in the add, we're going to create a new sound data object, and then we'll set, for example, the title equal to something, comma, and then the file path equal to something. And we'll just do this like, a dozen times to create one sound data object for each of the WAV files in my assets, audio, animals folder, okay? And so what we're going to do then is I'm going to just, instead of typing all this out, which can be quite a pain, I'm going to just copy and paste this, because it's really just an exercise in typing, and it would be easier at this point to just recommend that you spend the time understanding what it is we're doing rather than spend all this time typing. All right. So here's what I've done. As you can see, we left this line of code alone. We're creating a new sound group called data. We're going to set the data's title property equal to animals. All right, so that's what they're going to see in the pivot item title. And then we're going to create this thing called a base path, and that's really just a path to the folder that will contain all the WAV files. And so we can do something like this, and we just see this repeated over and over again. Data.items.add. So we're adding a new instance of the sound data class, and we're setting its title and file path properties at construction. So the title will be, for example, cat kitten or cat meow or chimpanzee. That's what we'll actually see in the little tile for each sound. And then the file path will be this base path. So in this case, assets, audio, animals, and then the actual WAV file. And we just do that like a dozen or 2 dozen times for all of the various sounds that we want to add. Then finally, after we've added them all, we'll just return our sound group object to the caller. And you can see now our animals property of our sound model class has been populated with a group, and a group contains a bunch of individual sounds, sound data objects. All right? And so what I'm going to do is just go through and repeat this process. In fact, let me roll this helper method up. And we're going to repeat this process for the remainder of these little helper methods. All right, so I pasted a bunch in. Let me just roll all these up. They all follow the exact same pattern, creating a new sound group, setting the title, setting the base path, and then creating individual sound data items and adding them to the items collection. All right, so now we have these 4 helper methods. And then what we want to do is go ahead and, for example, set the cartoons property equal to the helper method that will create the cartoons group. We'll set the taunts property equal to the create taunts group helper method, and we'll set the warnings equal to the create warnings group. And since custom sounds is a little bit different, we're going to save that to much later in this series of lessons, because that's going to contain all of the sounds that we record, and we're going to need to take a different strategy for that. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's run the app and see what we get by doing this. All right, very cool. So you can see that we see for the animals pivot item all of the animals. But wait a second, how do I navigate over to the other items? Well, we're going to have to fix something. So let's go ahead and stop the app right now. So after staring at this for a few moments, I went ahead and I set the breakpoints, and I think I figured out where the problem actually is. What I'm going to need to do in the view model, where we create the view model, or we get it, I'm going to do the check here, and we'll go view model.load data. There. So by adding an explicit call to load data in the app.xaml.cs, let's see if that fixes the problem. Let's rerun the app. Okay, so we're setting the data context still, but now we're going to start filling up because the first get will actually load the data. So everything should be happy from this point on. And now we got our pivot items and all of the associated sound groups with their collection of items, the sound data items. Very cool. All right, very good. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop that. Okay. So to recap, the big takeaway in this lesson is how we implemented the real data. While there's definitely different approaches that we could have taken, we chose to create helper methods containing hard-coded instances of our sound data and sound group classes in C#. We also saw how to reason our way through an odd timing issue with data binding. Debugging and understanding the order of events is a very valuable skill, as you can see right here. Now, don't forget the challenge that I made at the very outset of this lesson. I hereby challenge you to recreate this app using a different technique for data access, like expanding the sample data.xaml file with real data and then loading it at runtime. Try to figure that out, can you? I'll bet if you spend a day working on it, you'll have it working without my help. And you might learn more from that challenge and that exercise and the rest of the series, because you can only truly learn whenever you challenge yourself like that. Okay, so we're going to keep moving forward in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. Now that we have our data model loaded with live data at runtime, and not the least of which is we have the paths to all of the WAV files in our assets folder loaded, now it should be pretty easy to actually play those sounds, right? Because we know how to use a media element. So our game plan in this lesson is we're going to add a new media element control to our page, and we'll set the source declaratively, or rather we're going to set it programmatically. And then secondly, we're going to wire up an event handler that'll be triggered each time the user clicks on a different tile. And in the body of that event handler method, we're going to set the source property of the media element control to the path, the file path of the tile that was clicked on, or associated with the tile that was clicked on. All right, and so then it should play sounds at this point. So since we need a media element on each pivot item, I'm going to add that control near the top of the code beneath the layout root grid controls. So I'm going to put it right here. In fact, I'm going to get rid of some of this templated stuff too. We don't need that. All right, so media element. I'm going to give it a name because I want to access it programmatically. So I'm going to just call this audio player. And then I'm going to set the volume equal 1. And that's all I'm going to do for now. Obviously 1 is the loudest setting. So it's between 0.0 and 1.0. And so 1, we want it the loudest. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to add an attribute to the long list selector that'll be triggered each time a tile is tapped. So I used the technique that I demonstrated in an earlier video to allow Visual Studio to create the event handler's method name and create the event handler method stub. So let's take a look at the long list selector, and I'm just going to go to the last attribute, and I'm going to start typing selection change equals, and then I'm going to select the new event handler option in IntelliSense, and that will create something called the long list selector underscore selection changed event handler. Okay, so now what I want to do is just right click here. I'm going to select navigate to event handler, and we see that in our main page.xaml.cs a new method stub's created, and this is where I'm going to start adding implementing the code that will play the sound that's associated with the tile that's been tapped by the user. All right, so here we go. I'll explain what I'm doing after I finish typing. Okay, so let me explain what I did here in this event handler. So on this very first line here in line 40, we get a reference to the long list selector. And since we're potentially 5 long list selectors, we're going to need to go back and capture and send each of the selected change events to this single event handler code, right? So, since we have 5 of them, we're going to need to access the one that the user clicked on, or more correctly, we're going to need to find the long list selector whose list item was clicked on. Notice the as long list selector on the end of that line. This is a form of data type conversion. We know that sender is of type object, but we know it must be a long list selector. And so the as keyword used here will convert the sender to a type long list selector. Now, next we want to make sure that the selector is not null. Now, while it's not probable, it's entirely possible for something to have gone awry and some other type was passed in as sender. Now, we're just guarding ourselves against the possibility by programming defensively right here. Now, likewise, we want to access the list item that was actually selected. So we access the selector's selected item property and attempt to convert that to an instance of sound data. And so here again in the next line, we want to ensure that the data object is not null. Now, while it's probably not going to be null, it's possible, I guess, for something to have gone awry and some other type to be retrieved via the selected item property here. And so by checking for null, we're just guarding ourselves against this possibility by programming defensively. Now that we know we have a sound data object and it was the one that was selected by the user, we can easily set the source property of the media element to a new URI. Now you can see that the source property is of type URI. So we're creating a new instance of URI and using one of the overloaded versions of the constructor for the URI object to pass in the file path for the data item that was selected, and then to tell it what kind of URI this is. It's either relative or absolute. We'll talk more about this a little bit later, but let's run the app for now and see if it works or not. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click the cat kitten. All right, and I heard it through my little headset here, even though I don't have it on. I heard a cat kitten. Now I'm going to click the crickets. All right, and I hear the crickets. Now I'm going to do this. I'm going to click crickets one more time. Uh-oh, I don't get a sound now. That's because the selection did not change since I clicked the same tile twice, and therefore our event handler is not triggered. So we need to fix this. And the way that we're going to fix this is through just adding one line of code. We're going to merely set the selected item to null after we finish playing the sound. So selector.selectedItem equals null. All right, let's run the app again. All right, so now let's click crickets. All right, and let's click it a second time, and it works this time. Great. So there's only one task that is left to take here, and that is that, the change that we made to this first long list selector, we're going to need to add that to every one of the long list selectors. So I'm just going to go here, and it's going to point at the exact same method. All right, there we go. So now let's run it, and we'll go to a second pivot item and third pivot item and see if it still works. All right, so here we'll go chimpanzee. All right, and now let's go to cartoons. All right, I heard that one. Let's go to taunts. All right, and I think we're in good shape here. Let's go for foghorn. So I think we've got it working. So the big takeaway was how to programmatically work with the media player element by setting the source property to dynamically change the sound that's played. We learned about the as keyword, which performs conversions on compatible reference types. All right. In our case, we needed to cast the input property object sender to the long list selector and the selected item to our sound data class that we've created, the type that our data template was actually bound to. And then finally, we learned how to unselect a selected item in a long list selector by setting the selected item property to null. All right, great. Making great progress. We'll continue in the next lesson. See you there. Thank you.